The National Desk. Now.
We know people are anxious there about escalation. We are too. And again, everything we're doing and everything we're trying to do is to prevent any further escalation.
Preventative or provocative? The strong response to airstrikes in Yemen as world leaders tried to keep the Israel-Hamas war from spilling into a much larger conflict. Brutally cold temperatures for the majority of the country, where records could be broken, and the impact it could have on this election season. And a first for the Biden administration, the decision made in the Buffalo mass shooting, where 10 people were viciously gunned down inside a supermarket. This is the National Desk, America's News Now. I'm Amira David, and right now, severe weather threatening most of the United States, with all of the lower 48 states right now under some kind of weather warning today, impacting more than 200 million Americans. Heavy snow, damaging winds, and brutal cold are affecting large areas of the country through early next week. Severe storms were forecast today in parts of the South and also parts of the East, bringing possible flooding. And we could see several temperature records broken. Billings, Montana could reach negative 23 degrees tomorrow. More records could be broken through Tuesday. And some Republican presidential campaign events were canceled today ahead of Monday's Iowa caucuses. The storm is also bringing massive travel disruptions. Chicago O'Hare International Airport temporarily grounded flights due to snow and ice. More than 2,000 flights have been canceled today and more than 6,000 delayed. Former President Donald Trump among the critics of Joe Biden authorizing multiple airstrikes against Houthi rebels inside Yemen. Writing on his Truth Social, "We're dropping bombs all over the Middle East again. Now we have wars in Ukraine, Israel, and Yemen, but no war at the southern border." Meanwhile, the Iranian-backed Houthis have said they are not deterred, and all American and British interests are now legitimate targets, making a direct conflict between the U.S. and Iran maybe inching closer to a reality. National correspondent Kayla Gaskins joins us now from Washington.
American missiles lighting up the night sky over Yemen Thursday. The U.S. and its allies striking more than 60 Houthi rebel targets there.
This is an international problem that required an international response.
The Houthis are one of many groups financially supported by Iran as they launch attacks against the West. Iran also backs Hamas and Hezbollah in their fight against Israel, sparking fears a wider regional conflict will undoubtedly erupt.
I think this is a very dangerous situation, and the likelihood that the war is going to escalate beyond the territory of Gaza and beyond Israel versus Hamas is virtually certain.
Since October 17th, there have been at least 130 attacks on U.S. bases in the Middle East, injuring more than 60 U.S. troops.
This is a proxy war that the Americans are fighting and the Israelis are fighting against Iran. And the question is, how much closer are those principal adversaries going to be? Because the Iranians don't want a direct fight against the Americans. And yet, if their proxies start getting blown up in large numbers, then the likelihood that the Iranians get directly involved goes way up.
The Houthis vowing retaliation for Thursday's strikes in Yemen. Critics in Washington, like Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna, worry America's latest military action will only cause the situation to deteriorate further.
I think that this has increased the risk of retaliation against our embassies, retaliation against our troops.
The Pentagon argues they had to act.
No one wants to see a wider regional conflict, but again, we also cannot allow for this kind of dangerous, reckless and illegal behavior to continue.
Threat of a wider conflict could entangle the 45,000 U.S. troops already stationed in the region. In Washington, I'm Kayla Gaskins, reporting for the National Desk, America's News Now.
And Sunday will mark the 100th day since Hamas and other terror groups invaded Israel, killing as many as 1,200 civilians, capturing roughly 240 people as hostages. 31 Americans were among the dead, and at least 13 Americans were taken hostage. This was the backdrop of Israel's defense at the International Court of Justice in The Hague against the claim that they are committing acts of genocide with intent by their military response in Gaza, instead saying Israel was fighting for its right to live in peace and security.
The entirety of its case hinges on a deliberately curated, decontextualized, and manipulative description of the reality of current hostilities. That if there have been acts that may be characterized as genocidal, then they have been perpetrated against Israel.
Israel also played before the court this interview from October 24th, where Ghazi Hamid, a senior Hamas official, said in an interview, quote, "We must teach Israel a lesson, and we will do this again and again. The Al-Aqsa flood is just the first time, and there will be a second, a third, and a fourth." There are 15 judges on the court panel. The turnaround on a full ruling could be lengthy, but earlier I spoke to Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies about what we may know much sooner.
It certainly can take years, it usually does in these international arenas, for the full decision to be made. But what the South Africans did, they asked for a preliminary decision by the court on an emergency basis, because what's going on in Gaza is so urgent. People are being killed every hour, every day, children in the hundreds every day. So they asked for what they called provisional measures. And they're very basic things, 9 of them. The first one is to stop killing people, stop your military operations. The second one is to allow humanitarian supplies in. It's things like that that the court could issue a preliminary decision in just a few weeks.
Peyton Gendron, the 20-year-old suspect charged with the murder of 10 black people at a Buffalo supermarket in 2022, is now facing the death penalty. The death penalty is unconstitutional in the state of New York, but Gendron is facing federal charges. This is the first time in Biden's administration federal prosecutors are seeking capital punishment. Gendron's defense team said he would have pleaded guilty if the death penalty was taken off the table. Oregon's state Supreme Court declined to hear a case to remove Donald Trump from the state primary ballot based on the 14th Amendment insurrectionist clause. The judges ruled they must wait for the Supreme Court to rule on the issue. The Supreme Court says they will hear arguments on ballot access issues on February 8th. Hunter Biden is now willing to appear in a closed-door deposition before the House impeachment committees. This about-face comes 2 days after Hunter walked into a markup hearing for a contempt of Congress resolution. His attorney, Abby Lowell, wrote committee chairman James Comer and Jim Jordan, saying, if you issue a new proper subpoena now that there is a duly authorized impeachment inquiry, Mr. Biden will comply for a hearing or deposition. We will accept such a subpoena on Mr. Biden's behalf, Lowell wrote. There has been no comment from the committees, but House Majority Leader Steve Scalise announced today the full House is still scheduled to vote next week to hold Hunter in contempt of Congress. The U.S. debt surpassed $34 trillion, and it's just growing. Critics say reducing that bill needs to be a bigger focus of the presidential election, and national correspondent Janae Bowens is breaking down the numbers.
Hello, Iowa. As the 2024 primary season kicks off in just a few days, the issue of the national debt isn't a huge focus on the campaign trail.
Our Republicans did this to us, too.
We've heard presidential candidates like Nikki Haley use it to criticize her opponents.
Donald Trump added $8 trillion to our debt.
But some economists say there needs to be a whole lot more discussion on how the next president is going to tackle the country's $34 trillion national debt.
The United States is reaching a point we've never reached in our history, with government debt reaching over 100% of the size of the economy.
According to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, the more than $34 trillion of debt amounts to $259,000 per American household.
The skyrocketing national debt has been an issue for a while now. Now, just 20 years ago, that debt was at $7 trillion. That's a long way away from what we're seeing today at over $34 trillion.
It's like a crazy ant in the basement. Everybody knows she's there, but nobody talks about her.
Back in 1992, Ross Perot's presidential run focused on reducing the national debt.
We are looking on the edge of a revolution of young people who are starting to realize that we, our generation, have put them $4 trillion in debt, and they don't like it, and they shouldn't.
Chris Edwards, an economist with the Cato Institute, says when the next president enters office in 2025, the federal government will be raising $5 trillion in taxes, but spending $6.6 trillion, or 32% more.
I think the politicians, to be prudent, we want them to be prudent. They need to deal with the debt and deficit before it implodes and damages the standard of living of millions of American families.
It's an important issue. Edwards says presidential candidates from both parties should be putting out plans to deal with.
And Janae joins us right now from Washington, D.C. And Janae, here's the question. How much have the current presidential frontrunners contributed to the national debt?
Yeah, Amira. So according to the Committee for a Responsible Budget, former President Donald Trump added over $8 trillion to the national debt during his time in office. And as of 2022, the committee says President Joe Biden has added $4.8 trillion to the national debt, and that number is growing. Now, in both cases, the federal government spent trillions on emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Seems like everybody shares a part in the blame here. Live in Washington, D.C. for us, Janae Bowens, thank you so much. President Biden said today that Defense Secretary Austin's decision not to tell him initially about his recent hospitalization was, quote, a lapse in judgment. Biden said he still has full confidence in Austin. Austin, meantime, is still in the hospital after having complications related to prostate cancer surgery. The FAA is widening its probe of Boeing after a door plug blew off a 737 MAX 9 plane mid-flight last week. The initial investigation was announced yesterday. The FAA will evaluate Boeing's quality control and issues with the MAX 9. The agency will also rethink its own outsourcing of certain oversight to Boeing workers. Passengers are also suing Boeing, saying some of them were injured and that many were traumatized. Coming up in just a few days, voters will take to the polls in the Iowa caucuses. We're going to break down the state of the race. Then the IRS is touting its efforts to crack down on tax cheats, how the agency says funding cuts could affect its work. Then we investigate why the Navy is decommissioning what were supposed to be transformational warships. We're back in 90 seconds. Well, months of campaigning all coming down to Monday in Iowa, where Republican caucus goers will be the first to choose their nominee for president. A caucus is very different from a primary, and which voters show up to make their case for their candidate could make all the difference in the outcome. National correspondent Atra El-Nashar reports on the state of the race in the final days before the big election.
The frontrunner in the Republican presidential primary back in Iowa this weekend.
We have our best poll numbers. We have the best everything despite this, and maybe because of this.
Though former President Donald Trump spent much of the week in D.C. and New York courthouses.
In a way, I guess you'd consider it part of the campaign, because if you really look at it, they are doing this. It's never been done like this in this country.
On Saturday and Sunday, holding events in Cass County, which he won in 2016, and Warren County, where he came in close second to Senator Ted Cruz. Speaking of second place, it's considered a top prize for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley.
Put our own people first. We have to put governor.
Sharpening their attacks against each other.
We don't need another mealy-mouthed politician who just tells you what she thinks you want to hear.
The field of candidates shrunk this week when former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie dropped out. Businessman Vivek Ramaswamy and former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, who both poll in the single digits or lower, are still in the race.
And it's going to take somebody coming from the outside to get this right.
There's always a surprise in Iowa. I want to be that surprise.
An unwelcome surprise, the weather. Meteorologist Rebecca Kopelman at KGAN in Cedar Rapids says Iowa is bracing for what will be, by far, the lowest temperatures they've had all winter.
It's going to be wind chills of what it actually feels like to your skin of 20 to 30 degrees below zero at times. That's dangerous. I mean, that's the point where you just feel it in your bones.
The variable often hardest to predict are Iowa voters themselves, notorious for last-minute decisions.
Between Trump and DeSantis.
The feeling better strike, because I don't have an answer now.
They have until Monday night to decide. In Washington, I'm Atrel Nashar for the National Desk, America's News Now.
And by the way, on Monday, our Capitol Hill bureau will be in Iowa for the caucuses. Chief political correspondent Scott Thuman and national correspondent Atra El-Nashar will both be there covering voters and the candidates through Tuesday as part of our Beyond the Podium Election 2024 coverage. The IRS says it has collected another $360 million in past due taxes from millionaires, adding up to nearly $500 million recovered in total. The agency is touting the accomplishment made possible by Inflation Reduction Act funding as it prepares for more funding cuts. The commissioner says these cuts still wouldn't impact their work for a few years. And Citigroup plans to cut 20,000 jobs in the next 2 years. The bank announced this today, reporting a fourth quarter loss of $1.8 billion. It comes after the company revealed plans for a major corporate reorganization in September, when consultants said despite the significant loss, Citigroup still shows resilience. A new study now suggests prescriptions for ADHD jumped for young adults and women during the pandemic. The study, led by FDA researchers, reports there were 14% more stimulant prescriptions after 2020 than before. That equates to nearly 6 million more. The CDC estimates around 6 million children ages 3 to 17 have been diagnosed with ADHD. And we have reporters all across the country covering the issues that matter most to you. We're taking the pulse of America.
When the state's southern border looks like this, San Antonio's Migrant Resource Center mirrors it.
When the numbers swell up like that, the people in Eagle Pass are going one place. They're going to San Antonio.
Which is what's leading to the stark difference now. Almost no one outside the building when we flew over Thursday. The number of people seeking shelter here in San Antonio is dropping, and that's mirroring the trend at the border, too. But officials say it's only a matter of time before this shifts.
When the numbers swell like that, it impacts everything,
including city resources. Congressman Tony Gonzalez met with Councilman Manny Pelaez about the issue this week.
And they don't want to see San Antonio become go down the same mistakes that some of these other cities have gone to, more recently El Paso.
A new California bill aims to prevent law enforcement from using facial recognition software inappropriately. There are currently no limitations on such use there. The assembly member who introduced the bill believes a uniform policy across the state will promote community well-being.
The city of Chico police will use facial recognition in one way, but then you have the, Yuba County Sheriff's Department using it a different way. And maybe they'll coordinate, maybe they won't, but once you leave one jurisdiction to the next, all the software and the tools will be different. And so I think it's really important to have consistent tools.
Hearings on the bill are expected to begin in the spring.
The number of predators and people looking to exploit kids is astronomical.
Alex Doran is part of the FBI's Child Exploitation Task Force. The agency gets thousands of tips annually about crimes against children online. In Austin and San Antonio, they get multiple tips every day. The reports range from predators producing sexual assault material to sextortion, where kids are tricked into sharing explicit photos of themselves and then threatened to send money or risk the photos being made public. But you can take steps to lower their risk. Know your kids' social media accounts and passwords. Limit time spent online and consider taking phones and tablets away at night. Allie Armisen with the Cybercrime Support Network says you should pick a parental control app that is affordable, easy to use, and protects your personal information. App reviews can be a great place to start your research.
Well, coming up, littoral combat ships were introduced after 9/11 to meet future challenges, but now the Navy is mothballing them. We're going to investigate that after the break. Well, just weeks after the 9/11 attacks, the Navy announced a new class of warship. The Littoral Combat Ship, or LCS, was hailed as a transformational 21st century platform to meet future defense challenges. But recently, the Navy began doing away with the ships. Mark Hyman has this special report in tonight's Inside Your World Investigates.
I christen thee Sioux City.
It's shocking that they would continue to build these. We're decommissioning, but we're still commissioning. We just don't understand how that can be going on.
Bob Scott is the mayor of Sioux City, Iowa. His community was thrilled when the 11th Littoral Combat Ship, or LCS, was named after their city. But now he doesn't understand why the Navy is building new ships at the same time it's decommissioning ones that still have that new ship smell.
We thought we had a 30-year relationship with those crews.
The LCS was promised to last a generation.
The Littoral Combat Ship, it was doomed from the beginning. It's because it was a flawed concept.
Marine Corps veteran Dan Grazer is the Senior Defense Policy Fellow at the Project on Government Oversight. He's been tracking the LCS program. Grazer was not alone in his doubts about the ship. Several government agencies raised red flags before the first ship was even built. The Congressional Research Service, House Armed Services Committee, Congressional Budget Office, and the Government Accountability Office expressed deep reservations about the ship. The Pentagon's Test and Evaluation Agency gave it poor grades. Despite these warnings, the Navy launched an aggressive plan to acquire more than 50 of them.
Unfortunately, far too often you see Pentagon leaders making decisions based on talking points rather than actual hard concrete evidence.
As the ships were being added to the fleet, failures mounted. Acquisition costs doubled. Operating expenses skyrocketed. The ships are undermanned and the crews overworked. Structural cracks have appeared. Weapon systems are not working as expected. In 2016, 6 of the first 7 ships built were out of commission due to mechanical failures. Pentagon insiders told Inside Your World the LCS is a colossal boondoggle. A review of Navy documents reveals the lifetime cost to American taxpayers will be about $108 billion. 4 years ago, the Navy announced it would start retiring the LCS long before the 25-year lifespan. The 4-year-old USS Sioux City was among the first to be mothballed. About $1.5 million was raised for the ship and crew by Sioux Cityans.
It's disappointing that, no one has come forward and said, we're sorry that we did what we did, because I don't think they are, quite frankly. I'd like to not feel that way, but I don't think it matters to them.
Defense consultant Brian McGrath observed, decommissioning them is a terrible decision. But the only decision worse than that would be keeping them.
Future historians are going to look back on it and they're probably going to shake their head like, why did the U.S. Navy go down this road?
For Inside Your World Investigates, I'm Mark Hyman in Washington, D.C.
And coming up, furniture tip kits can save lives, but what happens when they fail? More on this recall when we come back in 90 seconds. Millions of furniture tip restraints and tip kits are being recalled over the potential of disasters from them detaching from the wall. The manufacturer New Age Industry says the plastic zip ties can break and cause furniture to just tip right over, which can lead to entrapment or worse, death. The kits were sold since at least November 2019. Replacement kits can be requested on the company's website. And that does it for this edition of the National Desk. We do invite you to join us again this evening for more coverage of America's top stories. Just check your local listings. I'm Amira David. Thank you so much for watching.